Thank you very much for this very warm reception. In Ireland, we feel very differently. Like all Palestinians, I feel more at home in Ireland than in any other Western country. Your heroic struggle against centuries of colonialism has always inspired our own ongoing struggle against Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. So thank you for that. This May 15th, as Palestinians everywhere commemorate the 70th anniversary of the 1947 to 1949 Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of the majority of Palestinians and the systematic destruction of our homeland, we always remember that there is still a vivid Palestinian resistance to this oppression. In 1948, when Zionist paramilitaries forced the family of my late grandmother, Rasmiye, out of their spacious home in the picturesque city of Safad at gunpoint, the Nakba became personal to my family. Its ongoing repercussions have shaped my identity and the identity of millions of other Palestinian descendants of refugees. To suppress the massive peaceful demonstrations in Gaza, where the absolute majority are Nakba refugees demanding the right of return, Israel has enacted a shoot-to-kill-or-maim policy, killing dozens and injuring thousands. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has condemned these crimes, while Amnesty has called on world governments, quote, to impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel. Will Ireland heed this call? With the unparalleled loyalty to its fanatic policies by the Trump administration and the US Congress, and the shameful complicity of the EU, Israel has become so drunk with power that it is dropping its thin, worn-out mask of democracy, shedding the veneer of accepting even a Palestinian Bantustan, and cheering Trump's rise to power as a rare opportunity to bury for good the Palestinian right to self-determination. Israel's government is perpetrating serious crimes against the indigenous people of Palestine with unprecedented hubris and impunity, thus the critical urgency. It is tightening its fatal 12-year-old siege of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, counting the per capita calories going in. It is intensifying land grabbing and building illegal settlements. It is entrenching what even the US Department of State once characterized as Israel's system of, quote, institutional, legal, and societal discrimination, end of quote, against Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel, enforced by more than 65 racist laws. Since 2016, Israel has been gradually demolishing the Bedouin Palestinian village of al-Hiran in the Nakba to build on its ruins a new Jewish-only settlement eerily called Hiran. Israel also continues to deny the internationally recognized rights of Palestinians in exile to return, and they constitute 50% of the Palestinian people. In the face of this ongoing Nakba and Israel's utter impunity, Palestinians at the most basic level are calling on Ireland, the EU, and the world at large to uphold their profound moral and legal responsibility to do no harm to us. By continuing its arms trade with Israel, trading with illegal settlements, and supporting companies that are involved in the settlement enterprise, as defined by the United Nations, the EU is violating its legal obligations of non-recognition and non-assistance to Israel's grave violations of international law. The EU, including Ireland, maintains a web of military relations, as was mentioned, weapons research, banking transactions, and settlement trade with Israeli companies, banks, and institutions that are deeply implicated in human rights violations. For instance, the EU imports goods from Israeli settlements at an estimated annual value of $300 million. Merely labeling some of these illegal products instead of fulfilling the responsibility to ban them is a dereliction of duty, to say the least. We're not asking Ireland for charity. We're asking your government to meet its legal obligations under international law. Beyond responsibility, we're asking for solidarity, not charity. Solidarity is not just a means to level the playing fields with the colonizers. It's an essential source of hope. Suppressing our hope and colonizing our minds with despair and defeatism, after all, have always been part of the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. As early as 1923, Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote, quote, "Every native population in the world resists colonists." He called them colonists. Zionist leaders used to be much more honest in the past. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. Zionist colonization must either stop, he says, or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach, end of quote. A key part of this iron wall is searing into our consciousness the indigenous population through hegemonic and sustained power, the imperative of submission to Israel's injustices as fate, and the futility of hope in resisting its regime of oppression. But hope that emanates from effective resistance is resilient and contagious. Despite decades of dispossession, occupation, Palestinians have not given up. We continue to resist oppression and to assert our quest for equal rights to all humans. This is precisely why Israel is desperately trying to suppress the BDS movement, a key part of Palestinian popular resistance and the most effective form of international solidarity with our struggle. BDS, after all, has not only insisted on the rights of all Palestinians, it has also rekindled Palestinian aspirations for emancipation, justice, and peace through its effectiveness in showing a nonviolent yet realistic path to achieving them. Begun in 2005 by the broadest coalition in Palestinian society, BDS calls for ending the 1967 occupation, ending the institutionalized system of racial discrimination within the 48 borders, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and upholding the right of return for refugees. These three basic rights correspond to the three main constituencies of the Palestinian people. Some might not know, but Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are merely 38% of the Palestinian people. 12% are Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel, and 50% are Palestinians in exile. Most recently, the Palestine Liberation Organization, despite its many problems, remains the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. It has reiterated support for BDS, which means BDS today has near consensus among Palestinians in historic Palestine as well as outside. Though launched in 2005, the movement is deeply rooted in decades of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance to settler colonialism. It's inspired and strongly influenced by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement. South Africa's Speaker of Parliament, Baleka Mbete, has recently stated, quote, "Apartheid in South Africa was a picnic compared to what we have seen in the occupied Palestinian territories," end of quote. Anchored in the universal principles of human rights, the Nobel Peace Prize nominated BDS movement has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Black racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. One's identity, the movement upholds, should never diminish or restrict one's entitlement to rights. Our movement targets complicity, not identity. BDS is an inclusive movement that enjoys growing support among diverse communities, including a growing number of anti-colonial Jewish Israeli BDS supporters, some of whom we have with us today, who play a significant role in exposing Israel's regime of oppression and advocating for isolating it. But what about impact? It sounds fine and recognize the strategic impact of the BDS movement assigning the overall responsibility for fighting it to the newly formed Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Former Israeli Mossad chief Shabtai Shavit admits that BDS has become a critical challenge to Israel's entire system of injustice, while former Prime Minister Ehud Barak admits that it's reaching a tipping point. A 2015 RAND Corporation study, RAND is a conservative think tank in the US. In a study in 2015, it predicted that BDS may cost Israel in the following 10 years up to 2% of its GDP. That's about $60 billion over 10 years. In the last few years alone, dozens of municipal councils across the Spanish state have declared themselves Israeli apartheid-free zones. Hint, hint. In France, defying the state's unparalleled anti-BDS repression, the two municipal councils of Clermont-Ferrand and Saint-Pierre-des-Corps voted to boycott the products of Israeli colonies in the occupied territory, joining the Paris region municipalities of Bondy and Ivry-sur-Seine. Councils in Norway and Northern Ireland, as has been said, have also adopted BDS-related measures, and a few weeks ago, of course, Dublin became the first European capital to adopt BDS for Palestinian rights. In September 2015, Veolia, the French corporate giant, became the first international company to bow to BDS pressure after a 7-year intense campaign and after losing more than $20 billion worth of contracts, including in Ireland. It was the first international company to get out of the Israeli economy. This has triggered a domino effect with companies like Orange and CRH pulling out later in 2016. Another company that has suffered, according to the Financial Times, reputational damage because of BDS, G4S, the world's largest private security company and a British company, remember, also abandoned most of its projects in Israel, but due to loss of contracts in Lebanon, Norway, Jordan, European Parliament, South Africa, Colombia, among others. But it remains deeply implicated in training Israeli police, who are notorious for committing human rights violations, and therefore G4S remains on the very top of our target list. Trade unions across the world have endorsed BDS, and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions was certainly among the first in 2007 to do so. Later, Irish teachers' unions have followed suit. In the first week of 2016, the $20 billion pension fund of the United Methodist Church, a very large Protestant church in the US, declared the 5 largest Israeli banks off limits for investment. Other mainline Protestant churches, like the Presbyterian Church, have divested from US or other companies involved in Israel's occupation. Dutch pension funds, Danish pension funds, and others have divested from Israeli banks for financing settlements. These and many other BDS developments in the economic field could not have transpired without years of academic and cultural boycott initiatives that have revealed Israel's brand to the world as one of brutal and illegal prolonged occupation and colonial rule, and held to account complicit Israeli universities and cultural institutions. Last year, an Israeli daily flashed the title, quote, "and the Oscar goes to BDS," end of quote, referring to the fact that in 2016, of all 26 Oscar nominees who were offered Israeli propaganda trips worth $55,000 apiece, none accepted the prize. In 2017, the Tel Aviv LGBT Film Festival faced a wave of cancellations by international speakers, while several prominent performers, including Lorde from New Zealand, canceled gigs in Tel Aviv. The Movement for Black Lives in the US has endorsed BDS, while more than 1,000 cultural figures in the UK signed a pledge in support of the cultural boycott of Israel, following initiatives, I have to say that, in Ireland, Montreal, and South Africa. So the British were not first. Also in South Africa, they were not first. Yes. Student governments in major universities in the West have voted for various BDS measures, including divestment from companies involved in the occupation. In Ireland, the Union of Students in Ireland and student unions in Trinity, Queen's University Belfast, and Galway University have all endorsed BDS. Academic associations in the US, such as the American Studies Association, the National Women's Studies Association, and others, have endorsed a full academic boycott of Israel, as did thousands of academics in Arab Gulf states, Brazil, South Africa, Ireland, elsewhere. In 2013, Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, boycotted an Israeli conference, heeding Palestinian and other scientists' appeals. It's important to reiterate in this context that the academic and cultural boycott that Palestinians are calling for is institutional, not individual. It does not target Israeli individuals, but institutions due to their proven complicity in Israel's violations of international law. BDS, therefore, does not infringe on academic or artistic freedom. BDS alone cannot take full credit, though, for the growing academic, cultural, and increasingly economic isolation of Israel's regime of oppression. Israel's behavior itself takes a lot of credit. The 2015 election of Israel's most racist government ever has inadvertently amplified support for BDS. Israel has become more openly associated with the rising far right, including xenophobic and indeed anti-Semitic groups in the United States and Europe. Trump has frequently cited Israel's policies as a model for his own xenophobic racist walls with Mexico and Arab anti-Muslim bans and so on. A leader of the alt-right, a major support base for Trump, has even defended the white supremacist movement's racist nationalism as, quote, a sort of white Zionism, end of quote. This unmistakable allusion to Israel's exclusionary foundations as a state that privileges Jewish settlers over the indigenous Palestinian population and that treats African asylum seekers as a cancer further exposes the often obscured contradiction between Zionism and liberal ideals. As this contradiction becomes more visible, support for holding Israel to account is growing among Jewish American millennials, crucially, and the broader US public. A 2014 poll showed that 46% of non-Orthodox Jewish American men under the age of 40 support a full boycott of Israel to end its occupation, 46%. A more recent survey by the Brookings Institution reveals that almost half of all Americans support imposing sanctions or tougher measures against Israel over its illegal settlements. Other than passing racist laws in the Israeli parliament at an unprecedented rate and government ministers adopting unabashed far-right racism, Israel's chief rabbi for the Sephardic community has recently called for the ethnic cleansing of non-Jews from the land of Israel. Leading Israeli political and military figures are deeply concerned about Israel's descent into an abyss. Ehud Barak said Israel has been, quote, infected with the seeds of fascism, end of quote. So the media here that wants to quote this is Barak, this is not me saying it. While the current, and this is even more important to report accurately if we have any media covering this, the current Deputy Chief of Staff in Israel, Major General Yair Golan, has compared, quote, revolting trends in Israeli society to Germany in the 1930s, as Hanin mentioned earlier. As a result, Israel's popularity is the fourth lowest among many states, as a 2017 BBC Globescan poll shows, and it is alienating the liberal mainstream like never before. Having lost most battles against BDS at the grassroots level, and recognizing that the movement is giving Palestinians hope that subjugation and settler colonial rule can be overcome, Israel adopted in 2014 a top-down new strategy for fighting BDS. Evoking memories of McCarthyism, this new strategy employs legal warfare, espionage, and intensified propaganda to demonize or even criminalize BDS advocacy. As a sign of utter despair, in its abortive attempts to quell the spread of BDS, an Israeli government minister has publicly threatened leading BDS activists, and my name was personally mentioned, with, quote, targeted civil assassination, while the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs has established what it termed a tarnishing unit to smear us. But Israel's job is not easy. Drunk with impunity, thanks to US and EU complicity, Israel's regime is arrogantly trying to delegitimize the boycott, a time-honored, non-violent tactic of resisting injustice, and thus it's trying to suppress free speech. In a major setback for Israel's war on BDS, the European Union, the governments of Sweden, Ireland, and Netherlands, as well as major international human rights organizations, Amnesty and others, have all defended the right to boycott Israel as a matter of free speech. Equality is the key to rights, the BDS movement believes, and it is therefore the sine qua non for a just and lasting peace. The most profound human right is the right to have equal rights, irrespective of one's identity, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But to achieve equality, freedom and justice must be realized, as many rights and justice movements all over the world keenly understand. Our diverse struggles for economic, social, racial, gender, and climate justice objectively share one common commitment to and passion for justice, for ending oppression, for attaining true equality and living in dignity. The intersectionality of our struggles is extremely important. Our oppressors are more unified than ever, and our oppressions are more intersectional than ever. It is high time for all of us to explore the intersectionality of our resistances. Divided, we fail. United, we prevail. What Ireland can or should do. As I presented on Thursday before the Orectas, did I pronounce that correct? Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs, Trade and Defence, in order for Ireland, as part of the EU and as a sovereign state, to fulfill its legal obligations, again, legal obligations, not charitable acts, under international law, it must, 1, impose a two-way military embargo on Israel, as was done against apartheid South Africa and as called for by Amnesty International. 2, prohibit entry of goods and services produced in settlements established in the occupied territories. As was mentioned, without trade unions lobbying their elected TDs on this issue, it will not pass. We need every trade union represented in this room to get the rank and file to lobby their TDs to get this passed. It is crucial. And it's a minimal first step of meeting Ireland's legal obligations. We should not present it as such a huge act of solidarity or even charity. It is not. It's meeting Ireland's legal obligations. 3, exclude from public tenders companies involved in grave misconduct, especially those implicated in Israel's illegal settlement enterprise like HP and G4S. 4, support the suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement until Israel abides by its human rights clause. 5, halt all financial transactions with Israeli banks that finance Israel's settlement enterprise. Instead of the Bank of Ireland closing the account of IPSC, shame on them, they should stop financial transactions with Israeli banks. The last thing that Ireland can and should do is stop considering, as part of the EU, the import of Israeli natural gas or electric power, given Israel's pillage of Palestinian energy resources. To conclude, despite its massive military power, including nuclear weapons, its unmatched influence in the US Congress and the EU, its second-to-none propaganda machine, and its patent intimidation system against everyone who criticizes its regime of oppression, Israel has failed to defeat or even slow down the impressive growth of our movement. No repression and no iron or concrete wall can extinguish the flames of well-founded hope. I have promised my late grandmother to keep hope alive and to never give up my modest contribution to this noble liberation struggle, no matter how cruel the repression gets. Her passion for justice and tenacity in resisting oppression have always inspired me profoundly. I shall not break that promise until Palestinians can live in dignity, justice, peace, and equality. Your effective, strategic, and practical solidarity can bring us closer to that moment. Thank you.